you're sitting in the bathroom. It's a little bit.
Who can't relate to sitting in the bathroom?
I know. Who can't relate to hiding from their kids just for a little bit?
Right.
Hey, mine are adults and I still hide from them occasionally.
There's nothing wrong with that. My hubby's been working, and then
I think, do you guys have a notice that says we're live?
Yeah.
Yep.
Perfect. So it did work. Beautiful. Yeah, I think one of the things that we were hearing is that military families often don't see themselves when it comes to things like this, like webinars or TV shows. There's such a stereotypical image of what a military family looks like. Yeah. So we're trying to just bring on variations to say like everybody looks like a military family, right?
Well, because there is no typical military family. There's no typical family. Everybody, the composition is different in each of them. They're all unique, right?
Right. And I think
nothing like Army Wives or Top Gun or anything like that.
Yeah.
I just saw a preview for the movie that's coming out about the Canadian Military Wives Choir.
No, it's actually about the British choir, the one.
Oh, so I totally made that up. Yeah, so the British, it looks amazing. It looks really good.
I would love to say that it's about us, and all my choir sisters would love to say that that movie is based on our lives, but it's not. It's based on our British military sisters.
It's the Brits. So I think we are live on Facebook right now. I think hopefully I set it up right. So we have a few minutes to get on, but what I'd love to ask is, as people start logging on, if they can give us a shout out and let us know where they're coming from, so we know if you're East Coast or West Coast, or sitting in Toronto with me, or in Ottawa with Monica, or in Trenton with Sarah. So
or share a picture of your bathroom, because we're all here.
Yes, and if you're not in the bathroom right now, go get into the bathroom. As this is the ideal space. I have a question before we begin. What is the bathroom cocktail of your choice right now? I feel like, Monica, you're our gin guru. Are you?
I am your gin guru, but I am not drinking gin. I'm drinking sparkling water because I made my best Padre buddy a promise that I would never drink gin before I spoke live. It's a very wise promise, and I stick to it to this day.
Where is the fun in that?
Oh, no, it would not be good. No.
Hey, Sarah, what are you drinking? Tell me I'm not the only one.
No. I went with cider. It's nice and hot outside. So
who do we have here? We have people coming in from Ottawa. We have people coming in from Stittsville.
Hey, that's where I'm at.
Really? Yay!
Yeah.
We have people coming in from Edmonton. Hi, Edmontonians. I wonder if that's Kim that's joining us from Edmonton. Hi, Kim, if that's you.
Troy joined us too.
Pardon me?
I think I saw Troy just joined us.
We have somebody from Embrun. Where's Embrun?
Embrun,
Ottawa.
Oh, in Ottawa. Okay.
Yeah.
Lots of Ottawa people. I feel like we're going to get a bunch of Ottawa people because of you today, Monica.
Yeah, I used to live actually 5 minutes from there. I lived in Russell when we were posted here the last time. So
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just have my CEO texting me saying, "Where the hell is Embrun?" That's I've only been to Ottawa like Parliament buildings. Is there anywhere close to there?
No. Okay. It's on the east. It's east of the city.
Okay, that doesn't help me at all then. I've been to Ottawa Central, and I've been to Gatineau. That's about as good as it gets.
Yeah.
Kind of in between Ottawa and Cornwall.
Yeah.
Have
you heard of Calypso Water Park? That's where it's just past Empress on this side of that. Yeah.
I'm just used to going down to downtown to eating at all the good restaurants there.
Yeah.
Good food in downtown Ottawa.
Yeah.
Why don't we get started? Because I think we're at 8:04. So why don't we get started? So to those of you who are joining us today, thank you so much for joining us, and welcome to the Command Post, Tales from the Bathroom. I am Stephanie Shapiro. I'm the COO of the Together We Stand Foundation. We are a military family foundation, and we were created to honor, support, and thank military families all across Canada. Thank you for joining me. We're live from the bathroom today because I don't know about Sarah and Monica, but it is the only place in my house I can get any kind of privacy these days. I've designated it as my home office. Although it's really disruptive when I'm trying to type something and my 8-year-old comes in and says she has to pee. So it hasn't worked out very well for me, but that's where I'm coming to you from. For those of you who weren't with us a couple weeks ago, this is our second episode of the Command Post. We are coming at you weekly to talk about various military family topics, what life looks like behind the scenes of military family, what military families' favorite COVID-19 cocktails look like, what it's like to raise kids in the military. And today we're going to be talking about grief. So let me welcome Sarah Rozema-Seaton. She joined us on the first episode, and let me welcome Monica Bobbitt. Monica, thank you so much for being with us today. I so appreciate you being here in the bathroom. I put on a bra just for so just in honor of you. So
it's a big day.
Yeah, it's a big day. I dressed up for the occasion. So thank you. And thank you for sitting with us in the bathroom. I appreciate you getting into the spirit of things.
I did. I gave up my cushy office chair for you, Stephanie.
Thank you. I mean, you have a really
nice, but
you have a really nice shower curtain. So
yeah, there you go.
That works out. And Sarah, you didn't bring your ice bucket into the bathroom this week.
I didn't,
but you did. You are prepared. Show everybody what you're sitting on. She brought the beach chair into the bathroom.
I highly recommend it, and it's got a cooler in the back, so
so it's fully loaded, right?
It's a fully loaded bathroom beach chair. Sarah, we learned about your background a couple weeks ago. You have been how long is it you've been serving?
I think it's coming up 21 years.
21 years, and in those 21 years, 7 deployments and 7 postings. Am I right? Did I make that up?
You kind of lose the count along the way, but it's about, seven deployments and then hundreds of different trips and taskings and everything else. And then we've done 7 moves, and some of them have been together, some of them haven't, depending on circumstances. So we've done 2 years of IR in there, which means the technical term is imposed restriction for anyone that doesn't speak military. And that just means that I lived in one place, he lived in another, because it wasn't a good, we just couldn't move our family at that time just because the kids were in school, and it just happens sometimes.
It was all while you were raising 3 kids, pretty much.
3 kids, yeah, and starting my business. So it's definitely interesting times.
And Monica, tell us a little bit, because you weren't with us 2 weeks ago, tell us a little bit about your military career and how you got here today.
So mine's the tragic, not so fun story, but Dan and I were married for almost 21 years. We did, I think we had 8 or 9 postings, moved like 9 times, 10 times, because we did an interbase move.
You moved 10 times?
I think so, something like that. I've lost track, but something like that. I can't keep track of all the postal codes and addresses. And of course we were in some bases multiple times, right? So, so we were married almost 21 years, and we got posted just at our 20th anniversary, got posted back to Petawawa. Dan had taken command of the 2nd Regiment, Royal Canadian Horse Artillery, which was his dream job. He was so excited that day. And we had to do IR for a little bit before we moved, because kids were in school. And so he took command in June, and then we moved back in August. And it was crazy busy because he was the CO. And then that following May, so 10 months later, he went to Wainwright on Exercise Maple Resolve, which is the biggest Army exercise every year. And unfortunately, he was killed in a training accident during the exercise. His lab rolled over at the bottom of a hill. And so that was, really unexpected. When they're in Afghanistan, you're prepared for that, but it was just training exercise. Mm-hmm. And, you kind of get used to them going in and out of the field. He was in and out of his lab all the time, every week. So it just, it wasn't something that I really was thinking about. So when they came to tell me, I was like, what are you talking about? He's only on an exercise. And I think it's easy for us to forget how dangerous their job is, even when they're training. Mm-hmm. So yeah, so that's kind of that's where this part of my journey started. I had no idea what I was going to do with the rest of my life or where I was going to live. And so I kind of had to pick myself up and put myself back together and kind of move forward with my life. And so I started writing as a way to help me process my grief. Um, I'm really comfortable talking about things now, but for me, grieving was intensely personal. And I felt that I had to share so much with so many other people because Dan's death was very public. He'd been the first CO killed in the line of duty since the 60s. It was just, it was, so it was really intense. And so I wasn't always sure of how to express what I was feeling, but I could do it when I couldn't get the words out verbally, but I could get it out on paper. So I started to write a blog, and then my father-in-law actually was the one who was very encouraging of me to share my blog. So I kind of shared, I started sharing it with friends, and then it just kind of kept growing and growing. And that kind of involved the Padre from Dan's unit, who's a really good friend of mine. He took over as the Padre after Dan died, and he encouraged me to share my story with other military families and with soldiers. And so it's just kind of grown from there. So that's kind of how I ended up here in my bathroom in Ottawa. It took a lot of twists and turns along the way before I got here, but yeah, this is where I'm at.
So. And now you're being forced to sit in your bathroom.
Yes, exactly.
When you started writing,
yes,
and you said that you were having to share so much of your loss with the public because it was a very public event, what was that like? Did you feel compelled here? Did you want people to know sort of what this process looked like, or was it more personal and kind of wait until you decided that you were going to disclose that to the public?
So I didn't start sharing what I was writing until probably 6 months or so, maybe after Dan died, or a few months after he died. The very first thing that I wrote was his eulogy, because we had done a funeral a week after Dan died. And we realized that it was really important, not just for us to be able to say goodbye to Dan, but for his soldiers and his friends that were in Wainwright. So we had another memorial service a month after he died. So, it was just basically like 2 funerals, right? You think it's not going to be as intense the second time around. That's a lie. It's, it's just like going reliving the entire funeral. So I didn't write a eulogy for the actual funeral because it was too soon, and I just couldn't do it. So, but I did want to do it for the memorial service. And I just felt like I needed to speak to Dan's soldiers, because he believed that the reason he was the CO was because of them. And I just really needed to speak to them and to their families. And I wanted to do it when the regiment was together as a whole. So that was the very first thing I wrote. Well, the first thing I wrote was the little speech for the media. And then I wrote that. And it was very cathartic. And that's when I realized that I can't always verbalize how I'm feeling properly, but if I write it down, then I can. Mm-hmm. So I did that. And then I think a few months later, I started, I was writing privately, but a few months later I said, okay, I'm going to set this up as a blog, and I'll start posting it and sharing it with my small group of friends. And so, so it just kind of evolved over time, but it took a couple of months before I started to share it.
You have like 19,000 followers on Facebook.
No,
you have quite the following. What is it do you think that was resonating so deeply with so many individuals? Were these individuals who had all lost someone, or is it the fact that you were talking about grief in general?
And I think it's, some of them are obviously, military families. A lot of them are military families. Or connected to the military. But the message of grief is universal, isn't it? It doesn't, you don't have to be in the military to experience grief or loss. Mm-hmm. And it's not just, it can be transferred to so many different aspects of life where you do experience grief, and it's so many different life transitions. And I think to be honest, I think what resonates is that I'm just authentic. Like I don't sugarcoat it. I don't pretend to be anybody other than me. I don't pretend to have all the answers, to be an expert on anything. I just, this is how I feel. This is how I look at things. And I think it's raw, and sometimes it's funny, sometimes it's not, sometimes it's, easy, sometimes it's hard. And I just share it all.
Right.
So I think that's what people relate with, and it's, all of us experience grief, but not everybody is comfortable writing about it or speaking about it. So, when you see somebody put down on paper and it's like, oh my gosh, I felt that way.
That's
right. And then you
feeling that I'm feeling.
Then you can relate, and it just makes it more approachable. And I think the other part of the reason why I did this too is because we have such stereotypical notions of grief, right? It's a conversation we should have more often, but we're so scared to talk about grief and death, as particularly in the military community, but just in society in general. And, and then because we don't talk about it, we have these very narrow, rigid views of what it should be. And I wanted to be the person to say, hey, wait a minute, it doesn't have to be that way, right? It doesn't, you can go through this traumatic, terrible experience, but there can be good that comes of it. And it's okay to talk about the good as well as the bad.
I think for military families, though, it comes out of a fear. Like if you talk, like Tim and I were talking about it the other, I don't know, it was a couple of weeks ago, because we were talking about things that we did prior to deployment. And I always had our family pictures taken because, and this is superstitious of me, but I'm like, if I get them taken, I will never have to use them. And for her, she's like, if I get them taken, I'm going to have to use them. So we have I think that there's a fear there.
Absolutely. And I think that's why. And I find, we don't want to talk about it. It's the elephant in the room. But this is with death in general, and in all of Western society. If we talk about it, then we acknowledge that it could happen to us. And it's like, just because you're talking about someone dying doesn't mean it's going to happen. It just means that you're going to be better prepared if it does happen.
Well, what's so interesting about this, Monica, and you taught this to me the first time, or one of the first times we spoke. You wrote a blog called the discomfort you're feeling right now is grief.
Yes.
And you talk so much about the fact that grief doesn't necessarily mean loss of life.
And that's absolutely true.
Tell us a little more about that. What do you mean by that? Well,
so when you think of grief, you automatically think of death, right? When somebody dies, you grieve. But grief is the experience you feel when you lose anything that's significant or meaningful in your life. So if you're divorced, you grieve. If your relationship breaks up, you grieve. If you lose your job, you grieve. If you lose a limb, you grieve. So, grief isn't just about death. It's about any kind of loss of anything that's important to you, whatever you think is meaningful.
And what's interesting right now is that, we talk about this pandemic, and we look at it from a global perspective, but let's bring it down to Canada, and the fact that Canadians over the last several weeks have been dealing with so much of that grief, between the fact that we are in lockdown, and so we're grieving the loss of our jobs and the loss of the ability to see our family and friends. And we had the Hero go down and lost 6 of our members. We just lost Captain Jen Casey. We had victims from the Nova Scotia shooting. What happens? How are we processing this as a country? What happens when we are collectively grieving? Or is that what we're doing? Are we grieving as a country?
Yeah, we're processing as we grieve. And I think that, people say, I feel like I shouldn't be sad because I don't know the people that died. But of course, it's natural, right? It's natural to feel heartbreak when there's such a mass tragedy in Nova Scotia, and you care about people and you empathize about people, and then in our situation where it's events that, the helicopter crash, the snowbird crash, those are things that resonate with us because, you know, we know these things can happen to people, like Dan's lab rollover, right? It resonated because, you know, anybody who's in the combat arms has probably been in a lab, right? So, you know, those things resonate and they impact us. And the way that we process our grief is, you know, people go and line the highway of heroes to pay their respects. They line the route when Jennifer Casey came home to Halifax yesterday. People lined the route, and that's how we express our collective grief.
Right. One thing you said to us as well, and I'm wondering, Sarah, if this applies to you as well, is that you talk about the emotional grief, but you talk about the fact that grief looks like so many different things that we don't anticipate it looking like. And you've written so much about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, it's interesting because when Dan died, I thought I knew what grief was, right? I have an honors degree in psychology. I just studied grief in university, but you know what? Studying grief and living it are two totally different things, right? And it's interesting, and I say this, the military spends a lot of time preparing soldiers to go to war, but they don't spend any time preparing wives to become widows. So when they come and notify you of a death, you know, you have your designated assistant, you have your padre, and they're talking to you about all the stuff that you're going to have to go through, you know, formalities and rituals and ceremonies, but nobody actually ever says to you, well, this is what your grief could look like, right? So, so the first few weeks after Dan died, I was like, I'm losing my mind. I can't remember things. I can't focus. I can't concentrate. I can't sleep. I was, you know, shortness of breath, heart palpitations. And so grief isn't just the stereo, you know, like when we think of grief, we think of the crying mother or widow at the grave,
like stages, right? Like the denial and
you know, and if you ask anybody what they know about grief, they're going to say, oh, well, the 5 stages of grief. You know, you've got your denial, your anger, your bargaining, your depression, your acceptance. Well, you know, the 5 stages of grief were never meant to be a guide. They were more, you know, they're not a map of grief, and you're not going to go from from step 1 to stage 1 to step 5 in this linear fashion. You might not even experience any of those things. Mm-hmm. That's not what, you know, those are, that you might or you might not, but grief looks so different for everybody, right? You know, so when they told me that Dan had died, I couldn't cry for the first, you know, X number of hours. And I kept thinking, well, what's wrong with me? My husband's dead and I can't cry. Well, I wasn't crying because I was actually in shock, but I didn't know I was in shock. So, you know, and for days, I couldn't, I would forget what I was saying mid-sentence. I couldn't concentrate, you know, my stomach was upset. And grief affects you, you know, it's a whole body impact. It's emotionally, cognitively, psychologically, physically, you know, so it's hard to say, well, this is what your grief is going to look like because you're a different person. So you might respond in a totally different way than I did.
Right.
But there's some common markers, right?
Sarah, your husband is in the Air Force. When the helicopter went down, your community actually intimately knew some of the individuals involved. What did the several days after that look like within the Air Force community? And on a personal level, knowing that your husband flies and knowing how intimate this is to you, what does that look like?
I think it's so different during the whole COVID piece because our communities are small, and especially the maritime helicopter community is really, really small. So I mean, we know some people in that community, but the difference when you add in COVID and social distancing and those sorts of things is that you don't have the same, you still have support, but it's not the same support as what it would be normally. So, you know, you've got, in a normal case, you've got, you know, people come around and they stay with you, or, you know, someone cooks meals, and you don't have that same piece. And then adding on top of that, when, you know, when they do the repat, I think one of the things for me is seeing everyone in masks. It's very, is that, and it's really surreal, and it kind of throws you a little bit because it's not normal. And not that any of this is normal, but it really is. I think the whole COVID and the pandemic and what that looks like has made things much more complicated. And it's not just for military, that's across the board. Like, when you've got funerals that can only have 10 people, and it's not the same process as anyone's used to. And so that whole face of what grief looks like is completely different.
I have a comment here from Elaine who's watching. She said, I accepted the fear when my husband was in the Army and deployed many times as part of his job, but I'm more fearful now that my son is in the Air Force. My question is, when there's a loss in the military, Air Force, Navy, or Army, and it doesn't affect you personally, and I don't know if this speaks more to Sarah, because obviously, Monica, yours was intimately personal. Is there a feeling at the back of your head? Does it make it harder to continue on each day? Is it a reminder of what could be, or is that part of that resiliency that you have to kind of build against it to not go there?
Oh my goodness, that's a tough one.
Yeah, isn't it?
Oh, way to throw out the tough questions there, Steph. I think we were here when Afghanistan was going on. That was probably the hardest thing that I think I've ever gone through, because you see so much of it. But if you live in that, it's always going to happen to me, you can't go on day to day. It's the same as, if you were married to a police officer, paramedic, or any of those kinds of jobs. If you think every day, this is going to be the day, you will never survive it. So, and it's their, in the great scheme of things, it's their job, and they love what they do. Like, when they're flying or when they're doing their job, or that's what they're trained to do, and that's what they love to do. It just comes with a different element of fear that may not be in the same jobs as some civilian jobs. But
does it feel different? I don't know if this is a silly question. Does it feel different when you are a military spouse or the family member of somebody in the military? Does it automatically feel like there is an added level of fear for what could be versus somebody as a doctor or a dentist, or is there something that's always in the back of your mind? I know you said, Sarah, that you don't want to go there, but as a spouse, as a family member, do you feel different from the rest of Canadians? Is there sort of a club that you feel like you belong to when you are a military spouse or a military family member?
Do you mean, like, is there like a greater understanding between military and family?
Yeah. Is there this
Absolutely.
understanding of what you all might be going through?
I think it's one of those things that I think you bond with each other in a different way and faster. I think as each posting goes on, you tend to find your communities a little bit faster. But I think too, the blessing to the other side of this is you tend to give more to your friends than, and you may not know them that well, but if someone needs something, you kind of like, yep, I'm in, and what do you need, and let's go for it. But it's ingrained to, when we move, we don't always have our families with us. So you tend to bond with these people, not only because you're in similar situations, and but also because they become your family, and they become your family fast. And there's probably very little that I wouldn't do for another military family if they needed it, because that's just how we're kind of, that's our life, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Here, Monica, for you, I have from Sheer. She's coming in from Thornhill. She says, thank you to all the families for their service. Her question is to Monica. Monica, when you were speaking with your children about the military and about their father's job and about your loss, how did you have that conversation with your children, either before his passing and then after?
So before, somebody's asked me that before, and I don't think it was what they grew up with, right? So until Dan went to Afghanistan, I don't think we really talk to them about the dangers of his job. It was just his job.
Mhm.
And then of course, we were living in Petawawa when he did go to Afghanistan, and they had friends who, there was a brother and sister and my two oldest, my daughter and my son's classes, and they lost their dad. And so, we had to talk about it. But we just, dad's going to Afghanistan. So they were, how old were they? They were 7, 9, and 11 when he deployed to Afghanistan. So to be honest, I don't even remember now what we told them about it, because it was, so much has happened since he came back from Afghanistan. So, and I can tell you, like, we never had that conversation again afterwards, because he, after he went to Afghanistan, he actually ended up, he hadn't deployed in 7 years when he died. And I mean, when he left for Wainwright, we certainly didn't say, oh, dad's going and it's dangerous and he might not come home. Like, that just didn't even occur to us to have that conversation with him before he went to Wainwright.
I think that the kids just know it as that's what their mom or their dad do. Like, because otherwise they've never. I remember being in when we were posted down to Oklahoma on an out of country posting, and we'd never had that conversation with our kids ever. And it was another child actually said it to our daughter, like, aren't you scared that your dad's gonna die? And that was like, it never had occurred to her. So I remember her coming home from school being so sad, and my husband was in Afghanistan. But that was, I mean, we got past it and we processed it and did all the things that we needed to do, but she had never really thought about it before, because it never even occurred to her, because that's just what her dad does.
And
well, I think Afghanistan changed everything for all of us too.
Yeah.
Because, my husband had deployed, Dan had deployed twice before Afghanistan, and both times to Bosnia. And I remember I actually had a neighbor, a good friend, who, she was a military widow, and I didn't know it for months after she moved in that she had remarried another soldier. And, and I remember not talking to her, but, like, well, first of all, it's, how do it's intrusive to ask those kind of questions. And I was young and I was like, oh, Dan's going to Bosnia. Nothing's going to happen to him in Bosnia. Right. Well, then Afghanistan, and back in those days, training accidents happened all the time, right? But back in those days, you didn't really hear about them. They were kind of quiet. They never made the news. Unless it happened on your base, you might not know what happened. So, and then Afghanistan happens. And to Stephanie, to go back to your point, I was always a little apprehensive when Dan went away before Afghanistan, but I remember being more concerned about him driving on Highway 17 back and forth between Petawawa and Ottawa in the wintertime than I did. I can honestly say I was probably more concerned about that than I was about him going out in the field on an exercise or a course, or sometimes he had to drive from Gagetown to Kingston or Pet in the wintertime for whatever. And I would worry about that more than I did when I worry about him being in Bosnia both times. And then, when they're deployed, you have that, you kind of hold your breath in anticipation, right? Because, when they're in Afghanistan and, however many people have died before they've gone, and people die while they're there. So you have that at the back of your head all the time while they're gone. I remember thinking, one night I woke up and I swore I heard my doorbell ringing, and like my heart was just pounding, and, and I was like that for the whole time he was in Afghanistan, for 7 months straight. And then we come back and he comes back and, it goes on a French course, and then we go out to the States for a couple of years, and then we go to Ottawa and he's in a staff job. So you kind of lose that edge, that sense of, of being on, pins and needles. And so when he went to Wainwright, I mean, and yeah, I've been around for 21 years, but it just never would just, he was the CO, he had an excellent driver, so it never even occurred to me to think, oh, something's going to happen to him while he's on exercise.
And
so
you were grieving after Dan passed, but at the same time, your kids were grieving. What is it like when, number one, you have to manage your kids during that process while you're dealing with yourself? And what happens when there's just so much grief in one household?
Well, it's intense. It is intense. And it was intensified because Dan died a month before our oldest son was graduating from high school. So he died just after Mother's Day, a month before our son graduated from high school, a month before Father's Day. So we had to go through all of that stuff without him. So, we didn't have time to we were still in shock when Connor was graduating from high school. And then Dan's parents had come to stay, and they came for the funeral. And then because it was Connor's graduation, and then 2 days after Connor's graduation was the memorial service, and then 2 days after that was the burial. So, there were 3 teenagers, a widow, and a mother and a father, all grieving in a 1,200 square foot house. In hindsight, we all realized that what we should have done was Stan's parents should have gone home and then come back for the graduation and the memorial, because, it was just too much for all of us. And, and I didn't want to be alone, but I knew I needed my space and they needed their space, but nobody wanted to step on any toes. Nobody wanted to hurt anybody's feelings. So we all did what we thought was best. But in hindsight, it wasn't what was best, because they didn't have the support that they needed from their peer group, right. And I had support and the kids had support, but they, and my friends were really great and they were really supportive of Dan's parents as well, but they needed their people. And they needed their space and their time to grieve. And it's hard to grieve when you're so many people so close together. And I sometimes think that the kids' grief got kind of lost in that. It got overshadowed by my grief, by the regiment's grief, by my mother-in-law's grief, because they're just the 3 kids, and they, and kids grieve totally differently than adults. But because my kids were older, people expected them to act and feel like adults, but they didn't, because they were.
What did their grief look like? How could you kind of explain it? What did it look like, and how did it vary from yours?
They didn't want to talk about it. They just wanted to get back to routine. They needed to be, they didn't want to cry in front of other people. That made them uncomfortable. And I think it just exhausted them. And, you try to talk to them and you don't, what do you do? Like, they're teenagers, so you don't want to push them too much to talk about it. And, they just wanted space to be by themselves, just the 3 of them. And it's hard to do because, God love the military. They're fantastic, but there's a lot of stuff that has to be done when a soldier dies. And there's a lot of meetings. So there was people in and out of the house constantly, and they just didn't have any privacy. So what we decided to do, and what the best thing we did, and I think this was one of the best decisions we made, is the kids went back to school after the funeral. They went back to school. They went back because they needed that structure. They needed that routine, and they needed to, they needed time to just be regular teenagers, right? They needed to not think about how awful their life was 24/7. And there's a tendency to do that when somebody dies. It's to focus on, how hard it is and to talk about it. But it's not always necessarily beneficial to everybody to always talk about it. You need to take a break from that grief.
And I'll ask this of both of you. When it comes to loss within the military, when it comes to the recent tragedy with the helos, with the snowbird crash, when it came to your husband's passing, do you feel like the Canadian population, do they offer community? Do you feel supported by the Canadian population when tragedy strikes in the military?
Oh, I absolutely did. Now, it's hard, because I lived in a military community when Dan died. So, Petawawa is, it's like being in a fishbowl, right? Like, there's only 15,000, 20,000 people. So, they're all very well aware. Even if they're not connected to the military community, they're very, very supportive. Would I have felt the same way in a smaller community? I'm not sure. But in Petawawa, I definitely felt the support.
And Sarah, did you notice anything like Canadian population wise when it came to the recent tragedies? Did you notice a change in behaviors or messaging or an uptick in terms of news?
I mean, there's always an uptake in use. I think it depends on where you are. Different areas are very, where we are right now is it's a big basis, about 5,000 people, like 5,000 members that are posted here. So it's the largest Air Force base in Canada. But I think where the bases are, like from having lived in like Toronto and Ottawa, and we've lived here and Oklahoma, you see how all of the different places are, how they support their military members and their families. I find that the bigger cities, it's not as much on people's radars as it is where you're in a smaller, I mean, Belleville, Trenton area is still, I consider it a small town, although I'm not, I think it's a city. But they kind of get it because they're around it. They see the uniforms all the time, and but in Toronto or in Ottawa, you just don't see it as much. And so I don't think it resonates as much with the Canadian population when you're in a larger city.
I want to come back to this idea that grief doesn't have to necessarily be about loss, and the fact that we are collectively grieving during this pandemic right now. Number one, I don't know that we as a population even identified the fact that we were grieving. I don't think we necessarily had a name for what we were feeling.
Yes, absolutely.
What I do see a lot of right now, and when I think of it as grief, whether it looks like anxiety or whether it looks like panic or whether it looks like lack of sleep, I see a lot of judgment out there right now in terms of the way people are handling this situation. Why do you think that is? Why is it that we are so quick to judge how one another grieves?
Well, I think it's a defense mechanism, right? It's I think we have very stereotypical ideas of what grief looks like. Well, if it were me, I wouldn't do that. You hear that a lot, right? If I were you, I wouldn't, and it's just, I think it's a way people cope with their anxiety. And I think it's partially human nature. It's just, we have this really bad tendency to compare our situations, right? We're all in the same boat, we say, but we're not all in the same boat. We're in the same storm, but we're not in the same boat, right? So your load looks different than my load, right? I'm a widowed mother of 3 older children. My son is in the military. I have financial security. I'm not worried about my career or my job. Somebody else might be. So their concerns are totally different than my concerns. So, we just have this tendency to just want to compare, and we want, we think that, and we do this when somebody dies, and I say this all the time. I know several military widows, and our husbands all died in very different manners. So yes, we've suffered a similar loss, but our experience isn't the same. Mm-hmm. And how they grieved is totally different than how I, grieve. And I think that's the same now. I know lots of people who've gone out and they've become very productive during this pandemic, and they've used this time and they've done all these crafts and they've done all these and that's how they've channeled their energy. And then I know other people who are, they're eating a bag of potato chips a day, and they're not. And you know what? Both are okay. Yeah, right.
And it could be a combination of both.
Yeah, that's right. It could be a combination of both. And so we're all going to respond to this in ways that are unique to us based on our personality and our circumstances and our experience, right? So, but I just think it's just people being people. Like, it's just, we just have this need to, and sometimes we do it to make ourselves feel better too, right?
Like, I'm grieving better than you're grieving. Is it?
Or I'm handling it could be worse. I could be dealing with this the same way this person is dealing with it, right? At least I've only gained 5 pounds and not 10 pounds like somebody else. You know what I mean? So,
or my loss is more than your loss, and it's
absolutely. And it's not a competition, right? And you know, I have to remember this because, like I've had times where I've been stressed and overwhelmed, and I've had to take a step back and take a deep breath and say, okay, this is not the worst thing that I personally have been through, but my neighbor next door who's now laid off and is stuck at home with 3 kids under the age of 5 while his wife is trying to do conference calls and they've lost half of their income. Guess what? This is the worst thing that they've been through.
I think it's really hard for us to remember other people's.
Yeah. And it's, and you have to do that. And we do that, with, you see that with all kinds of loss, right? And it's like, you know what? Yeah, you might have been, for you, this is the worst thing you've been through, but for them, it's a different worst. Their worst looks different than my worst does.
I want to turn our attention to some of these comments because we're getting some really wonderful dialogue here. First of all, you have a lot of fans, Monica. Sonia Campbell saying that she's watching from Greenwood and that she loves reading your blog.
Sonia.
I have Tracy Craig here from Ottawa, and she's saying that this is the most isolated that she's ever felt in a posting.
Yeah.
I feel like that's going around. That's got to be so difficult for military families right now who already must feel a sense of isolation. What is this looking like during COVID when you are a military spouse where your spouse is off at work either 280 days of the year or off on deployment? What is that looking like for families right now during this pandemic?
I think too, just the fact that people are being posted during this time, which it's a necessary thing, but I think it's compounded too, because you've got the loss of the kind of the moving, which is another loss every time you get posted because you have to say goodbye to friends or, and then you're going into a new situation where you feel very vulnerable and, you may not know anybody. And then to be isolated in that is another piece too.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think too, we have a lot of people who are deployed right now, right? Mm-hmm. So, there's a lot of people who are very fortunate to be going through this with their partner to help them to kind of share the load with the homeschooling. We have moms and dads who've never had to homeschool before. Now they're suddenly working full-time from home and homeschooling from home. And,
it is the worst. By the way,
teachers are my favorite people. Whatever you need next year.
They're not so worth their weight in gold, teachers. But there's a lot of military families in this country right now who don't have that support because their spouse is deployed halfway around the world. And not only that, their leave's been canceled, their HLTA's been canceled. So they don't even know when they're going to get to see their spouse again. And so they have that added uncertainty, he's supposed to come home in August, but he might not be able to come home in August because somebody might not be able to replace him. And then, you've got
vacation we were supposed to take is not happening anymore.
Or you've got people who are going off on deployments this summer and they're going for an entire year, but guess what? They probably won't get to come home on HLTA because of quarantine.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a whole other layer of grief that people have to deal with, right? So, and that is kind of unique to the military family, right? That, we have people who are deployed during COVID. So we've got a lot of people who are going through this completely on their own.
I wanted to start wrapping this up just because I can't believe how fast this almost hour has gone. And this has just been such an insightful conversation. I think before we go, what I'd love to do is ask about tools for grieving, whether it's grieving during a loss, whether it's grieving during this pandemic, or whether it's grieving, during anything. What are some tools that we can use to help ourselves get over? Is there a finite period of time we should be expecting ourselves to grieve and then we're supposed to past it or?
No, and that's one of the problems too, right? Everybody thinks grief has a time limit, but it doesn't, right? Everybody grieves in their own way, in their own time. And, when it comes to the loss of someone, the saying is you will grieve forever. The grief will soften over time, but that there's always going to be an element of that grief that you carry with you. One of the most important things you can do is to face your feelings because you can't bury grief. right? You can bury a person, but you can't bury the grief that comes with their death. You can try, and sometimes you can do it successfully but for a few months or whatever, but eventually it's going to come back to you, and it's going to be even more complicated because you haven't dealt with it. So face your feelings. Also, don't let anyone tell you how to feel, right? How you feel is how you feel. And I had people, tell me that I should feel angry, that I should feel guilty, that I should. And I'm like, no, I don't have to feel those things because you think I have to feel those things.
Can you feel happy?
Am I happy?
Can you feel happy during grief?
Yeah, you can have moments of happiness during grief. You can have moments of joy, and they might be brief and fleeting, but they're there. And I say, grab onto them and hold on to those feelings. I remember that, I'm in the midst of this tragedy. And the irony was that after, in those days after Dan died, I had never felt more loved than I did in those days after he died, because I was just wrapped in so much love and support. So, face your feelings. The other thing I say is you can't drink it away either, right? So much as it's tempting to drown your sorrows. I know, I'm looking at you too, ladies. I learned quickly. I learned very early on that gin was not actually my friend when I was grieving. So, watch your alcohol consumption, because alcohol is a depressive. It's not going to make you feel that much better. And you don't want to form those kind of habits either. Watch what you eat, too much sugar, too much crap. It's just going to make you feel icky. It's not going to help you.
I am feeling this pandemic.
Yes.
Yeah. A bag of Doritos a day and half a bottle of wine is okay.
Yeah. You should try to eat as well as you can. Another one is try to get adequate sleep, which is, I always kind of chuckle at that one, because if you're in the, who's sleeping properly right now? Geez, it's been 6 years. It was 6 years last Thursday that Dan died, and I still don't sleep through the night. So I would say try to get as much rest as you can. The other thing you can do is you can turn to creative outlets. So I wrote. A lot of people, one of the things they encourage you to do is journal. Just get your feelings down on paper. Another good one is to practice gratitude, so that tries to refocus you from your negative thoughts to more positive thoughts, right? So when Dan died, everybody kept telling me how miserable I was and how awful my life was going to be. And I would counter that by writing down all the things I still had to be grateful for. Yes, my husband was gone, but I still had 3 healthy kids. I had a roof over my head, so try to practice that daily. And one of the most important things you can do is get up and get moving, right? If you get out and you just do 15 minutes of exercise a day, go for a walk for 15, 20 minutes, it will shift your focus, right? And it will release endorphins, and all of those things will help you. Your immune system gets run down when you're grieving, right? So if you're not feeding your body properly, if you're not taking care of yourself, you're going to end up sick, which is going to compound your grief.
Mm-hmm. This is all great. And I think it's so relevant to what we're doing. I can tell you personally, through this pandemic, I was sleeping less, and I was eating more junk food, and I was drinking more than I would before, because I was trying to mask the feelings that I was trying to deal with, and I didn't know was grief for my normal life. And
you know what, Stephanie, you're not the only one. And I was doing the same thing. And I actually had to give myself a literal kick in the butt one day and say, okay, you are not coping with this well. You have the tools in your toolbox. You know what you need to do. Get up and do them. And I think the thing is we often think, okay, we're in this situation that we didn't choose, right? You can't control what happens to you. You can't control the fact that your spouse has died, or your child has died, or you've been diagnosed with an illness, or you're in the middle of a pandemic. You can't control that, but you can control how you respond to it, right? And if you make healthy choices, then you're going to cope better in the long run, and you will be much healthier for it. So it's all a matter of the choices that you make, the things that you choose to focus on. So, it's okay to feel sad. It's okay to be down. It's okay to eat a bag of Doritos, or a bag. In my household, it was those massive bags of mini eggs a few of those went downrange, but then you have to say, okay, enough is enough. Now I'm gonna, because you know what, in the long run, that stuff doesn't make you feel any better. It actually makes you feel worse.
Right.
So do you think too that, I mean, parents, especially ones that have little ones, need to maybe adjust what realistic expectations should look like?
Absolutely. Yes, they have to have better expectations, right? And I think that's why some people have just said, I can't, enough with the homeschooling, and only have certain, you can't expect to be a perfect at your job, perfect at homeschooling, have your house immaculate, have all the laundry done, you just can't. You have to take some of that pressure off of yourself and say, okay, today I'm going to do my best. And today my best is good enough, right?
This was great. Thank you, Monica. You are a force. Your blog is fantastic. For those of you who have not followed Monica in the past, her blog is called A Goat Rodeo. So is that what's the actual website, Monica?
It's so on Facebook it's A Goat Rodeo, and the actual website for my blog is agoatrodeo.com.
agoatrodeo.com. So thank you so much for being with us today. Sarah, as always, thank you so much for being with us. The two of you are just such powerful women. I'm so blessed to know you, and I really thank you for being so open and candid and raw and honest with us and with everybody who's watching today. So thank you both.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks for being in the bathroom with me.
Anytime. Anything for you, Stephanie.
Thanks, ladies.
Okay.